In this video, we'll look at the creation of the United States Constitution, the form of government we have today. First, we got to talk about why people wanted to revise the government, and that means we got to start with the tough economy the Articles of Confederation were facing. Americans were no longer forced to buy English goods by the Navigation Acts. And so what English merchants did was they were worried that colonists would start buying, French or other countries' goods and not their own. And so they cut their prices for Americans and they extended good credit terms to the Americans. Now, this was good for the Americans in one sense, but in another sense, it undermined the necessary growth of American industry, which America needed for economic independence. Also, at the same time, independence meant that the benefits of mercantilism no longer applied to the Americans. They faced suddenly high import taxes to sell goods to England. And also there were no more bounties paid for the crops that the English wanted. And this really hurt places like South Carolina and Georgia, who had sold so much rice and indigo to the English. Reacting to all this ensuing economic troubles, many states responded by printing a lot of paper money on their own, which of course quickly devalued and led to runaway inflation. With inflation unbelievably high because of all the states printing too much money, their own money, some states passed what they call stay laws, keeping creditors from collecting debts or delaying their own state taxes. In Massachusetts, however, the state government didn't pass any stay laws and actually raised their taxes. And soon a group of protesters led by Daniel Shays stormed a state courthouse and seized the state armory where they had the weapons. And then the Daniel Shays and his conspirators forbid the state from collecting taxes or any other creditors from demanding payment. The state government turned to the Articles of Confederation to help raise an army to put down what was called the Shays Rebellion. Congress, however, the Articles of Confederation, they weren't able to raise an army. They weren't able to respond. And while Massachusetts eventually regained control over Shays Rebellion, it raised the question that no one really thought of earlier. What if a state became tyrannical? Was there any checks on excessive state power? People who wanted a stronger central government than the Articles of Confederation, sort of American nationalists, they kind of oddly welcomed Shays Rebellion because, in a sense, it helped point out the problems of an impotent central government. They pointed out that the Articles of Confederation was so weak. Many people had lent the Continental Congress money to wage the revolution, and they saw a stronger central government as their only hope of getting their money back. Merchants and manufacturers and urban artisans realized that only a central government with the power to regulate commerce could protect them from foreign competition and win them better trading rights with places like England and France. And, still other Americans realized that with each state levying their own tariffs and duties between them, arguments would surely develop, tearing the nation apart. Even foreign governments welcomed a stronger central government because otherwise they'd have to negotiate 13 separate economic treaties and so forth. And, still more Americans wanted the federal government to have the power to tax so that it could raise an adequate army for national defense. Not surprisingly, these type of people were strongest in the West, where the Indians were a constant threat. And every state saw Massachusetts' troubles in putting down Shays Rebellion as worrisome because they might face a similar rebellion. So there was a lot of a lot of dissatisfaction with the Articles of Confederation. Well, what began as a conference between Maryland and Virginia over competing fishing rights grew into sort of a regional conference of mid-Atlantic states to settle economic disputes. And that, in turn, grew into a larger convention of all the states over, they thought, to revise the Articles of Confederation. This regional and then national meeting of the states' representatives to revise the Articles of Confederation is going to end up becoming the American Constitutional Convention. It is going to end up saying, look, we got to scrap the Articles of Confederation and completely start over. Rhode Island didn't attend because it feared a stronger central government. It was a small state. And a lot of famous people didn't attend. Sam Adams and Patrick Henry boycotted it, afraid of a stronger central government. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson didn't come because they were in Europe as diplomats for America. The average age of those in the Constitutional Convention was 42. The youngest was 26 and the oldest was 81, and that was Benjamin Franklin. And the delegates chose George Washington to preside. After the Revolution, he was widely respected by people who otherwise disagreed. As the Constitutional Convention began to, mull proposals, there were several models to work from. One was called the New Jersey Plan, and that really was just a strengthening of the Articles of Confederation. It kept a unicameral one-house Congress, but gave the federal government power to tax and regulate commerce. Congress would elect a committee to serve as an executive, so there was no presidential office. Since each state had only one vote, and the states had, all the states were equal in that sense, the smaller states liked it. One of the delegates, Alexander Hamilton from New York, he suggested an extremely powerful government that really gave not much power at all to the states, and that terrified a lot of people. There was also the Virginia Plan, largely developed by the Virginian James Madison. It called for a bicameral legislature with representation in the legislature determined by the state's population. So larger states have larger populations, would have more representation. It also called for one chief executive, but his powers would be limited by Congress. Delegates voted in favor of the Virginia Plan over the New Jersey Plan, but it was obvious that modifications would be necessary. The smaller states didn't like the idea of representation, obviously, and threatened to walk. Because the Virginia Plan is going to end up being the basis for the U.S. Constitution, Madison's often known as the father of the Constitution. He was a close friend of Jefferson. We'll talk more about him later on. But he advocated that there should be a system of checks and balances, rules on different branches of government, so that no one branch becomes too powerful. You can see his proposal that Congress would limit the powers of a president. But the checks and balances, of course, is absolutely integral to the Constitution as it ended up. Eventually, a number of compromises were made that made the new Constitution acceptable to the 9 states that the delegates agreed would be necessary to ratify it. The greatest of those compromises was regarding the representation issue, and it's often called the Great Compromise. It was offered by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, shown here. He said, why don't the lower house representation be determined by the population? So in the lower house, the larger the state, the more people, the more representation it'd have. But in the upper house, each state would have equal representation. Each state would have 2 representatives. And, that was obvious that that was the compromise that they adopted. The Senate, every state has 2 senators, and larger states have more representatives in the House of Representatives. You can see in this Constitutional Convention, some people fear the ignorant masses, and others, they fear the power of the elite few. So what they also compromised on was, in the lower house, the people would elect their representatives directly. But in the upper house, the state legislatures would elect the 2 representatives that each state had. The assumption was that the state legislators would be a bit more savvy and a bit more knowledgeable than the everyday person. The question of slavery threatened to tear apart the Constitution, so they compromised here. Were slaves considered population for representation purposes? And it's kind of funny because southern states who were arguing that slaves weren't people, weren't citizens and all that, they wanted them counted as people because it'd give them more representation in the lower house. And many of the northern states which didn't have slavery, and were arguing that slavery was not a great thing, they were saying, no, those slaves are slaves and they should not be counted towards the Southern representation. It was so a bit ironic there. And what they ended up settling on was that the slaves would be considered 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. In addition, there would be a ban on the international slave trade 20 years after the Constitution was ratified. So 20 years ended up being after 20 years would end up being after 1808. The federal government would stop the international slave trade. It also provided for fugitive slave law that said all states had to return runaway slaves. In a sense, this compromise kind of punted the whole issue of slavery to future generations. They figured they'd done enough compromising for one generation. Indeed, the slavery issue obviously is going to play the role in causing the American Civil War later. The Constitution made the federal law the supreme law of the land, binding all states to the federal government. And it established a series of courts headed by a Supreme Court to adjudicate cases arising from the Constitution or to settle cases between states or citizens of a different state. There was no, however, clear indication that the Supreme Court could rule or review on the constitutionality of acts of the other branches of the government or judicial review. That would come later, and we'll talk about that later. One of the most difficult problems was deciding how the president should be elected. If Congress or the state legislators should elect him, it could seriously undermine his authority. But again, some feared the ignorant of the masses, and they just wanted free elections for everybody. And there was a question of should people in small states have the same right to choose the president as people in large states, and all of that. So what they ended up doing was compromising again, and they created the Electoral College system. The Electoral College, the people would vote, but and that would be the popular vote, and that would help inform what they called electors, and the number of electors would be determined by the number of congressmen each state had. And the electors would take the popular vote under consideration, but they could vote any way they wanted. And the assumption was, again, that these electors would be a bit more knowledgeable than the everyday people. And of course, the Electoral College is still in use today, although today the electors almost uniformly vote according to how the popular vote went in their state. The Constitution also provided for a chief executive that Madison had originally called for, and they decided to call him a president, and he would be elected every 4 years. The brilliance in the Constitution was Madison's balance of powers. For a bill to become law, it had to pass both houses of Congress and be signed by the president. Now, the president could veto the bill, but Congress could override the veto with a 2/3 vote. The president was commander of the military, but Congress had the right to declare war. Congress had the power of the purse. Only Congress could appropriate money for the government. And by the way, all appropriation bills had to originate in the lower house, which was seen as closer to the people. But the president led the daily operations of the government and the execution of the laws. The president could negotiate treaties, but all the treaties had to be ratified by the upper house, the Senate. The upper house of the Senate was elected every 6 years, and the lower house was elected every 2 years, which is considered a little bit closer and responsive to the people. The president would appoint the Supreme Court, but only with the advice and Senate and kind of the approval of the upper house, the Senate. And once approved, the Supreme Court justices were elected for life, which makes them above the partisan politics of their day. So, all of this you know from your civics class, but it's this balance of powers is absolutely essential to the American form of government. The Constitution did leave some specific questions about the role and size of the government kind of vague or open. To ensure that the federal government didn't get too strong, the Constitution stated explicitly that the federal government only got those powers granted it explicitly, that the only powers listed, and all the others were granted to the states. Still, some worried because one clause in the Constitution, known as the elastic clause, a necessary and proper clause, said that the federal government had all the implicit powers it needed, as all the powers that were necessary and proper to carry out the functions of this Constitution. This is called the necessary and proper clause, and that, of course, is open to interpretation, and some people have called it, therefore, the elastic clause. It seemed to give the federal government some leeway and power than just saying, the federal government only has the enumerated powers explicitly listed in it. So that was kind of some contrast there in the Constitution. In retrospect, the Constitution is a pretty amazing document because it's smart enough to state general principles and not specific rules that are necessary. It allowed for it to be amended as times changed, but made that very difficult to do. The founding fathers realized that times could change it, and each generation would need to interpret it again as they themselves saw fit. It created what do you call a democratic republic. And I want to talk here a bit about what a democracy and what a republic is. In a democracy, the people themselves decide. They vote. In a republic, elected people vote, but for officials who then make the decisions. And if the officials don't if people don't like the decisions the officials elected have made, then they can change the elected officials. That's kind of called a republic. Well, you can see there are elements of both directocracy and a republic in the Constitution. Again, the fear of the masses versus the faith in the masses, a fear of the elite versus a faith in the elite. So they created a hybrid, a democratic republic. Some historians have adopted the view of a constitution as a sort of a conservative reaction to the democratic revolution. And the Articles of Confederation were much more democratic in that sense, as I just said, and the Constitution was a democratic republic. It moved power arguably a little bit further away from the people than it had been in the Articles of Confederation. And in this sense, it was a step back from democracy, protecting the rich and the moneyed interest. Proponents of this view have noted that almost all who attended the Constitutional Convention were lawyers. You have one of the first historians to make this claim was the famous historian Charles Beard, shown here, and he was writing earlier later in the 20th century. In any event, this concludes the video on the creation of the Constitution, and the next video will go into, of course, the effort to ratify it.